So why do we need to feed a different food in winter?
So it all comes back to this effect of temperature. As the water gets colder, the fish's metabolic rate drops. And it's, we can roughly say it's sort of for every 10 degrees C drop in temperature, the metabolic rate halves. But it's sort of not really as linear a relationship as that when we look into it in more detail. But that's a sort of general rule of thumb. So if the fish's metabolic rate is dropping, then they're not going to be growing as much. So they're going to not need as much protein for a start. So one of the misconceptions with feeding winter foods is that winter foods are lower in protein. You see this sort of in the sort of popular literature these wheat germ foods, as they tend to be called, when I'll come talk about what wheat germ is in a moment, but you tend to see that it's lower protein because the fish don't need as much protein. We can see for us completely the reverse is true. Our winter food, our wheat germ food, is 31% protein compared to the typical summer food. A maintenance diet for fish in the summer is 28%. So that completely flies in the face of what we thought we knew about winter foods for fish. They're higher in protein. So it's not so much about the amount of protein, it's about how digestible the protein is. And wheat germ protein is highly, highly digestible. So the fish don't need anywhere near as much of that protein, that's true, but we're not feeding the fish as much food. We're not putting in the amounts of summer food that we put in the summer. We put nowhere near that amount of wheat germ food in. So we're getting less protein overall, but we're doing that by feeding less, not by feeding the same amount of a lower protein food. So as the temperature declines, the fish don't need as much protein, but what they do need, because the declining temperature means their metabolism is so much slower, that they need something that's much more easier to digest. So we can see here on this graph here then showing us then as the temperature is declining, we can then see each spot on this scatter plot here being the temperature and metabolic rate relationship shown for lots of fish species, and we can see this sort of roughly non-linear relationship as they're coming down. The metabolic rate here has been measured in this case by the resting oxygen consumption. So this is telling us that fish in colder water don't need as much oxygen as fish in warmer water. So the cooler the water, the less protein is required for the fish, but the more inefficient the digestive system is going to be. So that protein needs to be much, much more digestible. And wheat germ protein is so much more digestible to the fish, but it's not complete. It doesn't contain everything the fish need. So what is wheat germ? Well, if we look at the anatomy of the wheat grain, we've got the sort of outer husk here, the bran layer, we can call it if you like. The endosperm then, which is what the bulk of the wheat is, it's a sort of the starch that is going to provide the fuel for the wheat germ, which is the little sort of embryo, the bit that's going to, the new wheat plant is going to grow from is down in the germ. And if you are milling wheat grains for flour, you really just want this endosperm layer. The germ can affect the baking quality. So the germ is a bit of a sort of a waste product, if you like. But historically, I think it's a practice starting from Japan, using this wheat germ to feed fish in much cooler water just gave them a really digestible protein source. The fish are not growing in the winter, or rather their growth rate slows right down. But so they're going to be growing, but really, really slowly. And it's really that protein that is needed for growth. So in the summer, we need the fish to have a complete protein source that provides them all of the building blocks they need to fuel that growth. And the typical protein source that we'd use in fish foods is fish meal, and that has got everything the fish needs to grow. In winter, the fish isn't eating as much, it isn't growing so much, so it doesn't need that complete protein source, but it still needs some protein because it uses that protein for energy. Whereas we as mammals, we get most of our energy from carbohydrates. fish are much less dependent on carbohydrates, and they use proteins and fats for their energy source. So throughout the winter, though the metabolic rate has dropped, it's not zero. The fish is still respiring. There's still metabolic processes going on. It's just they're much, much slower. So we've got to make sure there is a fuel going into the fish, but that fuel is not being also used for growth and repair. If we're not supplying the fish with that fuel, that protein and oil to a lesser extent, then it's going to start raiding its body fat reserves. It's going to start raiding its fat reserves. It's going to lose condition throughout the winter as it's raiding those energy sources, and it's going to get lighter. And it's going to, its metabolism is going to change quite profoundly. It's going to lose condition throughout the winter. And then we get to the spring, which is a really challenging time for fish. And that fish is in a poor state when it comes to spring. If we can keep supplying the fish with a really small amount of this really easy to digest protein source, then that provides it the energy it needs to get through the winter. We're not then chucking in handfuls of the food 3 times a day, as we would be doing in the summer to a big fully stocked pond, but we're just going out and feeding the fish a few floating pellets, and they'll come up and take a few of them and then disappear again. And really, we want to keep doing that until the fish no longer appear for food. Let them control when they want to feed, rather than us just saying, well, it's winter, I'm not going to feed.